know Nero Wolfe, and if you don't, I envy you for the discovery ahead.
Hey
And
guys,
you know that the worst
welcome to my new
possible hour
mystery.
to come knocking at the brownstone is between lunch and dinner. The man has carved up his life like one of Fritz's cold veal roasts. Precise slices, nothing overlapping, and certainly no stray crumbs left on the edge of the plate. The sacred hours after lunch are for orchids, digestion, and silence. So when the bell rang at 4 minutes, I did the charitable thing and considered not answering. But Wolfe has this uncanny radar for doorbells. Even in the plant rooms upstairs, the sound registers like a personal affront. He called down through the hall. "Archie." Answer, which made me the executioner. On the stoop stood a woman whose presence would have cracked even the most orderly household. She wasn't young, though she had the poise of someone who had once turned heads and never forgot how. A tailored grey suit, gloves the color of ash, and an expression that suggested she had already rehearsed the scene inside a dozen times. She held a slim leather case in one hand, like it contained the answer to a riddle, only she understood. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, without asking if he was in. "I need Mr. Wolfe." That, right there, was the kind of sentence that could make me ignore Fritz's warning about indigestion and usher her straight into the office. So I did. She took the red leather chair like she'd earned it. Wolfe, already back behind his desk, was rearranging his patients in neat stacks. He gave her the look he usually saves for the possibility of food poisoning. "Your name?" Wolfe rumbled. "Agatha Yates," she said. "You may have read my plays, or perhaps only their reviews." I had in fact read the reviews, well, the ones that got into the tabloids between murders and scandals. She was a hostess of a different sort, not a socialite serving cocktails, but a playwright whose soirees drew half the theatre crowd, and the other half came to whisper about them later. "What do you want of me, madam?" Wolfe asked, eyelids barely lifting. Agatha Yates drew a breath and leaned forward, gloves still on her hands. "I am being written out of my own story, not by critics, by someone who knows the ending before I do. My manuscripts have been read, tampered with before I finish them. Scenes altered, notes stolen. I cannot say how, but I know who benefits." Wolfe grunted, which in his language was a paragraph. "You suspect theft of your intellectual property. An inconvenience, but hardly criminal in the sense that concerns me." Her eyes flickered, sharp as tacks. "You misunderstand, Mr. Wolfe. Last week I found a scene from my new play, quoted word for word, at a dinner party I'd not attended. And yesterday I discovered a letter missing from my study desk. That letter named the person I intended to confront." That earned her a lift of Wolfe's brow. Not much, but enough to register on the Richter scale. "And the beneficiary?" Wolfe asked. Agatha Yates pressed her gloves tighter against her knees. "I host gatherings. Writers, actors, financiers. One of them, perhaps more than one, is feeding on me like a parasite. They're waiting for me to confront them, to expose myself. I need your mind, Mr. Wolfe. Because soon the ending will be theirs, not mine." I watched Wolfe study her with the detachment of a man considering whether a new orchid species was worth cultivating. He closed his eyes, opened them again, and sighed as though someone had handed him a plate of canned spinach. "Confound it, Archie," he muttered. "See that she has coffee. I will hear her particulars." That was Wolfe's version of throwing open the curtain on Act 1. And judging by the set of Agatha Yates' shoulders, she already knew the ending. She just didn't know who would deliver it. Agatha Yates had the posture of someone who expected the world to bend toward her when she spoke, and I don't mean that as a complaint. Plenty of people come in here leaning on Wolfe like he's the last oak tree in a windstorm, but this woman had a way of settling into the office as if it had been constructed for her comfort. Wolfe naturally bristled at that, since he has opinions about who belongs in his domain and how long they're allowed to breathe the air. Fritz brought in a tray with coffee and a plate of small butter cookies, which I placed on the table between Wolfe and Agatha. She accepted a cup without sugar or milk, a sign either of strength or of someone rehearsing for strength. Wolfe didn't take any. Coffee after 4 was an abomination to him, and Fritz knew better than to offer. I asked her to start with the basics: dates, times, names. She looked directly at Wolfe and ignored me, which wasn't unusual, but I had to admire her style. She gave it like a performance, pacing her words, adding pauses where a critic would underline them. 2 weeks ago, she said, she had been drafting her latest play, working at odd hours. She was the kind who kept her notes on paper, fountain pen, leather-bound books, the whole romantic rigmarole. At one of her evening salons, her word, not mine, an actor she invited had repeated lines that matched her unfinished script down to the punctuation. She thought it coincidence until it happened again with another guest at a dinner party she did not attend. Then, as if that weren't enough, the letter naming her suspected culprit vanished from her locked study desk. Locked, Wolfe repeated, chewing the word. And who had the key? No one but me, she said, too quick. But keys can be made. Drawers can be forced. They can, Wolfe allowed, but a dramatist who permits porous locks and unsecured manuscripts is complicit in her own affliction. The parasite requires a host. You have furnished it. She bristled, but didn't flare. If Wolfe had expected her to storm out, he would have been disappointed. She leaned back and folded her gloves in her lap. You will find them, Mr. Wolfe. Because the thief is not simply stealing paper, they are stealing my authority. If they succeed, I am nothing more than a hostess whose guests eat her alive. That got Wolfe's attention. He doesn't like being compared to anyone's tool, least of all the kind of pack of actors and critics might pass around. He sighed, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Names, he said. She gave them. 4 of them at least, with enough background to provide the skeleton of a Broadway melodrama. First, Victor Kent, an actor with a chin that had launched more fan clubs than performances worth remembering. She claimed he had a habit of reciting other people's wit as if it were his own, which in her book was the artistic equivalent of theft. Second, Lila Forrester, a rival playwright who had been polite in public and poisonous in private for the better part of a decade. Then there was Raymond Ray Dorn, a producer with pockets deeper than his morals, who had backed her plays before turning to newer, hungrier writers. And finally, Catherine Dale, her assistant, a sharp-eyed young woman who typed Agatha's drafts and had access to more paper than anyone else in the house. Wolfe opened his eyes long enough to glance at me. That meant, in our shorthand, that the legwork was mine. Madame, he said to Agatha, the brownstone is not a revolving door. I will not admit a parade of thespians and scribblers into this room. If you require me, then Mr. Goodwin will fetch you information, which I will weigh in due course. Agatha smiled faintly. I expected no less. Your office is your sanctum, but if you mean to understand, you must allow them to enter your world at least once. They will not speak to you otherwise. They thrive on stages, even improvised ones. That was a direct shot, but Wolfe let it land without reply. He gestured, which in his language meant she could leave. She rose smoothly, set her cup back on the tray untouched, and gave a nod that felt like an exit line. When the door closed behind her, Wolfe muttered, "Pfui." You don't believe her? I asked. She believes herself, that is sufficient. Theatrical folk, Archie, are unreliable narrators. They live by simulation. Still, something is wrong. She has been touched where it pains her most, and that produces real desperation. We shall look. That was Wolfe agreeing to a case, though he'd rather eat canned soup than phrase it that way. The next morning, I started with Victor Kent, because actors are easiest to find. They follow light and applause the way flies follow sugar. He was rehearsing at a small uptown theater, strutting on stage with the air of someone auditioning for himself. I caught him between takes and asked about Agatha Yates. He grinned like a man polishing his teeth for publicity photos. Agatha, brilliant woman. I owe her everything. Funny, I said. She thinks you owe her more than that. His grin twitched. You mean the lines? I merely quoted something I heard in conversation. It stuck in my head. From her. From someone. Don't ask me who. I move in circles, Mr. Goodwin. Words float. If she thinks I pilfered her manuscript, she's flattering herself. I don't need her scraps. But he did. I could tell by the way his hand curled when I mentioned critics. He was a man built on borrowed applause, and the thought of being caught at it had him sweating under the stage lights. Lila Forrester was a different story. She received me at her apartment, which smelled of cigarettes and lavender, and eyed me like a mosquito with a typewriter. Agatha sent you, she said before I'd opened my notebook. Of course she did. She suspects me because she has always suspected me. If her words are wandering about town, they're walking on their own legs. I don't need her work. I've been ahead of her for years. She spoke with the sharpness of someone cutting her way out of a trap. She admitted to attending Agatha's salons, but denied touching her papers. Still, I noticed a pile of scripts on her desk, one with Agatha's name in the margins. She caught me looking and laughed like it was the punchline of a joke only she enjoyed. Ray Dorn, the producer, was harder to pin down, mostly because he didn't care to be pinned. He had the manners of a man who bought respect wholesale. When I asked about Agatha, he waved a cigar like a general ordering troops. She's brilliant when she delivers, but she stalls. She broods. The theater doesn't wait, Goodwin. If I could find someone to finish her work before she does, I'd consider it a bargain. That was as close to a confession as you could expect from a man like Dorn, but it was also the kind of half-truth producers thrive on. He admitted he had access to her notes once, back when they collaborated, but denied recent theft. The assistant, Catherine Dale, was the youngest and the hardest to read. She had the nervous polish of someone aware she was under suspicion. I type what she dictates, she told me, straight-backed in a little office filled with stacks of paper. That's all. If she has enemies, they're in the room with her, not here with me. But she flushed when I mentioned the missing letter. That told me enough to bring back to Wolfe. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk with a beer. He listened without interruption, eyes half closed, only opening them to grumble at Fritz for not chilling the glass enough. When I finished, he sat still, as though the air had thickened. Finally, he spoke. 4 suspects, each with motive, each with opportunity, each with the temperament for folly. But one has trespassed more directly. Archie, I require confirmation. Something has been displaced. Not merely stolen, but moved. Until we discover what. This remains rehearsal. Which meant, in Wolfe's language, the case had entered the brownstone. And once that happens, the ending is inevitable, though not perhaps the one the hostess thought she knew. If Wolfe had his way, the circle of suspects would remain theoretical, confined to my notes and his brain cells. He prefers his villains abstract until the time comes to swat them like flies. But Agatha Yates had different instincts. She called me at 10 in the morning, a time when Wolfe was still in the plant rooms, and announced that she had arranged for her guests to meet Wolfe in person. Not all at once, mind you. She wasn't reckless, but one by one, under the guise of her usual social calls. She said it as if she were doing us a favor, which in a sense she was, though Wolfe would call it meddling. I didn't bother to mention it to him right away. He would have barked an order forbidding it, and then, 3 hours later, issued a grudging consent once his logic caught up with his appetite. So instead I let it simmer until Fritz's lunch had been demolished, and then, while Wolfe was dabbing mustard from his lip, I said casually, "We'll be receiving callers this week. Agatha Yates is sending her suspects over." He gave me the look he usually reserves for people who suggest ketchup on steak. "Confound it, Archie. Do you think this is a parlor?" No, sir, but she thinks it is. And frankly, it's not a bad idea. You can study them on your home turf. She did the work for you. He growled, but didn't forbid it, which was as good as a green light. The first to arrive was Victor Kent, the actor. He made an entrance the way men like him make breakfast, loud, flamboyant, and just a shade too oily. He stood in the office doorway with a grin that said he'd signed his own autograph on the way over. Wolfe stayed behind his desk, implacable, while I invited Victor to sit. He didn't sit so much as sprawl, legs crossed, hands gesturing as if every word he spoke was a spotlight cue. I can't imagine why Agatha thinks anyone would want to pilfer her scribbles, he said, smiling at Wolfe as though they were old pals. I mean, she's marvelous, but I'm Victor Kent. I'm not starving for words. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, which in his case counted as verbal jousting. You are an actor, he said slowly. An actor is perpetually starving. That pricked Victor's veneer. He laughed too loud, as if to cover the wound. Come now, Mr. Wolfe, surely you don't think I'd stoop to theft? I think, Wolfe replied, that you stoop for applause. And if applause lies on the page before you, you're not above pocketing it. That silenced him long enough for me to note the flicker of unease in his grin. He left soon after, muttering about rehearsals. The next day, Lila Forrester. If Victor had filled the room with noise, Lila filled it with smoke. She lit a cigarette before I had the chance to stop her and sent up a cloud that made Wolfe's nose twitch like an alarm bell. But he didn't order her out, which told me he wanted to see how she played. She had a smile like a knife blade. Agatha's frightened, isn't she? She always did think the world was conspiring against her. If her precious drafts have gone wandering, I can promise you I didn't carry them. I've enough of my own to drag around. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Yet you keep her scripts in your apartment, he said. She froze, just for a fraction, then laughed. Oh, Archie mentioned that, did he? Observant boy. Yes, I study her. We all study each other in this business. Rivalry sharpens the mind. Or dulls it, Wolfe murmured. She stayed only long enough to make her contempt clear. When she left, Wolfe instructed me to open the windows and declared that her performance had been entirely derivative. Ray Dorn, the producer, came third. If Lila was smoke, Dorn was steam. Warm, moist, and oppressive. He carried a cigar he didn't light and made himself at home in Wolfe's office chair until I nudged him toward the red leather seat. Look, gentlemen, he said, waving a hand. If Agatha's worried about her pages, she ought to worry about finishing them, not guarding them. Deadlines don't wait. If someone's helping her along, she should thank them. Helping her? I asked. Well, carrying her load. Filling in blanks. Ghosts have made more plays than playwrights, you know. And I'm not admitting anything, I'm just saying, in this business, ideas are a currency. Who really owns a word once it's spoken aloud? That line made Wolfe grunt, which in his dictionary meant Dorn had just said more than he should have. Dorn puffed his unlit cigar and left us with the scent of arrogance. Finally, Catherine Dale. Unlike the others, she arrived nervous, clutching her handbag like it contained evidence. She perched on the edge of her seat and answered Wolfe's questions with clipped syllables. You type her notes, he said. Yes. You have access to her desk. Yes. You handled the missing letter? No. Her eyes darted to me, then back to Wolfe. I wouldn't betray her. She took me in when I had nowhere to go. I owe her everything. Wolfe studied her, silent, long enough for sweat to form on her brow. Then he dismissed her with a nod, not because she was innocent, but because he had no more use for her just then. When the door closed, he leaned back and exhaled. A circle of parasites, Archie, each with motive, each with appetite. But one is more desperate than the others. Desperation is the flaw we shall exploit. Which one? I asked. He didn't answer. That was his way of telling me I'd find out when he was ready. That night, over beer, he spoke again, almost to himself. Words are power, Archie. To some, they are more intoxicating than money. The theft here is not of paper, but of authority. Whoever took those drafts intends not merely to profit, but to control, to dictate the ending before it is written. I jotted it down, because when Wolfe starts sounding like a philosopher, it usually means he's closer to the truth than he lets on. The next few days brought little peace. Agatha called twice, voice tight with urgency, asking whether Wolfe had made progress. He told her to wait, that haste is the enemy of clarity. She didn't like it, but she complied. Meanwhile, Saul Panzer rang me with a quiet tip. Someone had been shadowing me after my visit to Lila Forrester's. A tall man, hat pulled low. Not professional, but deliberate. I passed it on to Wolfe, who closed his eyes and muttered, "So they are watching us as we watch them. Excellent." What he meant, of course, was that the trespass had expanded. Someone had left the theatre of Agatha's salons and stepped into ours, and once the brownstone is disturbed, Wolfe digs in his heels like a bull preparing to gore. I knew then that the curtain was still rising, and the play had just moved into our house. Whoever the thief was, they had written themselves into Wolfe's script, and in Wolfe's script, the ending never favors the intruder. Wolfe's definition of legwork is the distance from his chair to the dining room. Anything beyond that is my problem. He issued his instructions the next morning with the solemnity of a judge handing down a sentence: "You will observe, inquire, and report." Nothing more. Which in Wolfe's mind is as close to "go find the culprit" as he'll ever get. So I set out to prod Agatha's circle until one of them squealed. Not literally squealed, though I wouldn't put it past Victor Kent. But in the theatrical world, people leak information the way faucets drip. The trick is to catch the drops before they evaporate. I started with Victor because men like him can't resist performing even when the house is empty. I caught him at Sardi's, holding court at a corner table with two chorus girls who looked like they were being paid in champagne. He greeted me as though I were a critic with a full page to fill. "Goodwin, sit. Sit. You'll love this story." I did sit, but only because the view was too instructive. Victor launched into a tale about his upcoming role, a lead in a play still in rehearsal. I didn't bother hiding my interest when he described a scene, because it sounded suspiciously like one Agatha had sketched in her missing draft. When I pointed that out, he laughed so hard he almost knocked over the champagne. Coincidence, my boy. The theatre is full of coincidences. A line here, a gesture there. We breathe the same air. We dream the same dreams. I leaned in, and sometimes you read the same pages. That landed. His grin wavered, and the chorus girls noticed. He brushed it off, but the damage was done. He knew I was watching. Sometimes that's all you need. From there, I went to see Lila Forrester. Her apartment was even smokier than last time, as if she was trying to fumigate the guilt. She poured herself a drink and offered me one, which I declined. "You're still hounding me," she said, eyeing me like a cat watching a mouse decide whether to squeak. "Tell Wolfe I don't play second fiddle to Agatha. If I wanted her lines, I could write better ones myself." "Funny thing," I said. "You keep her scripts on your desk. You don't keep everyone's." "Why hers?" She smirked, exhaled a ribbon of smoke, and tapped her ash into the tray. "Because she fascinates me. She always has. You don't understand what rivalry does to the mind, Goodwin. It's not about theft. It's about obsession. I measure myself against her, page by page. That doesn't mean I'm stealing. It means I'm sharper." I left her with her drink and her smoke, but I didn't buy the denial. Obsession can turn into theft with less effort than it takes to light another cigarette. Ray Dorn was trickier. He had the habit of surrounding himself with people who laughed at his jokes, which made it difficult to pin him down in private. I cornered him in the lobby of the theater he partly financed. He puffed his unlit cigar like it gave him authority. "Listen, Goodwin," he said. "I don't care about her scribbles. Plays come and go. What I care about is profit. If someone's feeding me lines early, so what? Saves time, saves money. I call that efficiency." "Efficiency is one thing," I said. "Theft is another." "Bah. Words are cheap. If Agatha wants to guard hers, she should lock them in a vault. Don't wave your morality at me. I deal in contracts, not confessions." That was the closest he'd come to honesty. Dorn was the kind of man who didn't need to steal words himself. He could pay others to do it, which meant he was either complicit or complicit adjacent. That left Catherine Dale. She was in Agatha's townhouse when I dropped by, typing furiously with the posture of a student afraid to misspell. She jumped when she saw me, then tried to hide it by busying herself with papers. "Miss Dale," I said, "you're in a tough spot. You have access, and access is opportunity. If that letter walked away, you'd be the first suspect." Her face went pale. "I didn't take it. I swear I don't need your swear," I said. "I need your truth. What do you know?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I think someone has a copy of her study key. I found scratches near the lock last week. I didn't tell her. I didn't want her to think I'd failed." That was something. She might be telling the truth, or she might be planting a story. Either way, it was new material. By the time I returned to the brownstone, I had enough threads to knit a sweater. Wolfe listened in silence, sipping his beer, eyes closed. When I finished, he opened them slowly, like a man waking from a nap he'd planned 3 weeks in advance. "Each of them," he said, "has motive. Kent for vanity, Forrester for rivalry, Dorn for profit, and Dale for proximity. But the theft itself, the trespass, was not crude. It was delicate. Someone not only took, but rearranged." "Rearranged?" I asked. "Yes. You told me Miss Yates described her missing letter as one naming her suspect. Its removal was not mere theft. It was prevention. Someone feared exposure. That narrows the field." "Which one?" He didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes again, as if the answer would grow in the dark. "Finally," he said, "we must provoke them. Apply pressure, invite them into contradiction." That meant more legwork for me. I spent the next 2 days needling the suspects, dropping hints, watching reactions. Victor became jumpy, watching the shadows as if critics were hiding in them. Lila grew sharper, snapping at me for daring to doubt her genius. Dawn laughed too much, the laugh of a man who feared silence. Catherine avoided me entirely, retreating into Agatha's townhouse like a prisoner barricading herself. Then came the moment Wolfe had been waiting for. I returned one evening to find him frowning at his desk drawer. He gestured for me to look. The drawer was ajar by less than an inch. "I did not open this," he said flatly. I checked the contents. Nothing missing as far as I could see. His files were intact, his stationery untouched, but the drawer had been disturbed. "Someone was here," I said. "Precisely. A trespass. Deliberate, restrained, and insolent." He leaned back, his eyes glinting. "Now we have them." I didn't ask who he meant, because I knew. The suspects were circling, and one had stepped into the brownstone itself. Wolfe's fortress had been breached, and that was the kind of insult he never forgave. He picked up the phone and dialed. "Mr. Panzer," he said when Saul answered. "I require surveillance. 4 names. You will watch, listen, and report. Someone has forgotten that the stage is mine." When he hung up, he reached for his beer, calm as ever. But I knew better. Wolfe doesn't tolerate intrusions. The brownstone may look like a house, but once you cross its threshold uninvited, you're on his stage. And in his stage play, the ending is written before the curtain even rises. If there's one thing Wolfe hates more than canned soup, it's someone treating his house like Grand Central Station. The desk drawer incident might not have produced a missing paper or a smoking gun, but for Wolfe it was more than enough. The brownstone is sacred ground. A trespass inside those walls means war. I spent the better part of the next morning double-checking locks, testing windows, and making Fritz swear that he hadn't forgotten to bolt the kitchen door. Fritz looked at me like I'd accused him of poisoning the souffle. No chance he had slipped, which meant someone had been inside and someone had been precise enough to leave only the faintest clue. That kind of subtlety isn't the trademark of your average burglar. It smelled of a hand practiced in secrecy and practiced close to our circle. Wolfe didn't say much, which was more unnerving than a tirade. He sat, eyes closed, fingers steepled, looking like a man meditating on the extinction of courtesy. Only when I brought in the morning mail did he stir, glancing at the envelopes as if they were part of the crime scene. He finally said, "Archie, you will redouble your observation. Someone believes themselves clever. We must let them believe further." That was Wolfe's way of saying I was bait. I didn't relish the role, but it came with a paycheck. I spent the afternoon at Agatha Yates's townhouse, watching Catherine Dale type with nervous efficiency, while Agatha paced the parlor like a general awaiting dispatches from the front. She was sharper than before, edgy, snapping at Catherine for trivial mistakes. The missing letter had cut her confidence deep, and the news that Wolfe's desk had been nudged hadn't soothed her. I didn't tell her that part. It was Wolfe's call whether she should know. While there, I caught sight of something that nearly made me whistle. On Agatha's mantel sat a slim notebook, not quite concealed under a stack of mail. The cover was scuffed, but I recognized the handwriting from a quick glance. It matched Agatha's neat, sweeping style. Catherine noticed me noticing and moved fast, sliding it into a drawer with a snap that said the subject was closed. When I asked her about it, she flushed. "Just notes," she said. "Uh-huh," I replied, but the way her eyes darted toward Agatha told me the notebook held more than recipes. Later that evening, I checked in with Saul Panzer. He reported that Victor Kent had been skulking outside Lila Forrester's apartment 2 nights running. He hadn't gone in, but he had lingered, smoking nervously, before vanishing into the dark. Dorn, meanwhile, had met privately with a junior playwright known for producing scripts at suspicious speed. Catherine Dale had been seen mailing a package late at night. None of it was proof, but the threads were tangling. When I laid it out for Wolfe, he grunted. "They are agitated," he said. "Pressure reveals fractures. But we need a fulcrum. Something must tilt the balance." As if on cue, the balance tilted itself. The next morning I found a note slipped under our front door. No envelope, just a folded sheet of plain paper with typewritten words. It read, "She doesn't deserve it. The ending belongs to me." I showed it to Wolfe. He read it once, twice, and then placed it flat on his desk as if he were laying out evidence in court. "A confession," he said, "but anonymous confessions are theater. They seek reaction, not resolution." "Or maybe they're rattled," I suggested. "Precisely, and we must rattle them further." He looked at me, which in Wolfe's language was the equivalent of pointing a pistol. "You will inform each of our quartet that I have discovered the thief. Say no more. Merely that." That was a recipe for fireworks, and he knew it. I made my rounds the same day, delivering Wolfe's message like a postman with a lit fuse. Victor Kent reacted first with laughter, then with panic. He grabbed my arm outside the theater, eyes wide. "You don't mean me, do you? You can't mean me." I told him Wolfe would reveal in due course and left him biting his nails. Lila Forrester went colder than ice. "Tell Wolfe to do his worst," she said. "If he thinks he's clever enough to trap me, let him try." But the twitch in her lip gave away more than her words. Ray Dorn chuckled, puffing his unlit cigar. "Good. If Wolfe has found the thief, maybe now I'll get my investment back. Tell him to call me when it's done." But his chuckle was hollow and he fumbled the cigar. Catherine Dale nearly broke down. "I didn't do it," she cried, clutching my sleeve like a drowning swimmer. "I didn't take anything. Please, you have to believe me." I told her belief wasn't in my job description and left her trembling. By the time I got home, I half expected Wolfe to have orchestrated a full performance. Instead, he was reading a book on Balkan cookery, calm as butter. He looked up, nodded once, and said, "They are stirring." Good. Let them. That night, the trespass escalated. I had gone upstairs to check the windows when I heard Fritz call sharply from the kitchen. Someone had tried the back door. The lock held, but the mark of a tool was visible on the brass. Wolfe came down himself to examine it, which told me just how seriously he took it. "Now," he said, eyes narrowed. "They are reckless. They are desperate. That is progress." I didn't see it as progress. More like an invitation to burglary, but Wolfe thrives on desperation. It means the culprit is nearing collapse. The following afternoon, Agatha herself stormed into the office without appointment, agitation all over her face. She dropped a letter onto Wolfe's desk. "This was in my mail today," she said. The letter was typed, like the one we had received, but the words were different. "If you accuse me, I'll ruin you. Keep silent or lose everything." Wolfe read it slowly, then set it beside the first note. "Ah, a duet," he murmured. Agatha's voice shook. "They mean to destroy me, Mr. Wolfe. Whoever it is, they want me silenced." "Not silenced," Wolfe corrected. "They want ownership. You are their vessel, and they would rather break the vessel than see it used by another hand." She sank into the red chair, exhausted. "Then you must end this. Please." Wolfe shut his eyes, folded his hands, and said, "We are nearly there, madam." The trespass will betray them. And betray it did. That evening, Saul called with news. He had tailed Catherine Dale to a print shop downtown, where she left a package marked for courier delivery. Saul had intercepted just long enough to note the address. Victor Kent's apartment. When I told Wolfe, he smiled. A rare thing. Ah, the noose tightens, but not around Victor's neck. I asked him what he meant, but he refused to elaborate. He simply reached for his beer and said, "Tomorrow, Archie, we summon them. All of them. They will sit here and they will perform, and I, seated, shall direct." I knew then that the curtain was about to rise on Wolfe's favorite act, the office gathering. The trespass had crossed too many lines, left too many prints on locks and drawers. Someone thought they had written the ending, but Wolfe, as always, held the final draft. I've often said that working for Wolfe is like being a man with two lives. One that plays out across New York's sidewalks, elevators, and cafes, where people talk too much and don't say the one thing you need. And another that takes place in that brownstone, with Wolfe sitting like a king who refuses to budge, conducting a silent orchestra, where each player doesn't know his instrument yet. By Thursday morning, I had lived both halves hard enough that I felt like someone should be paying me time and a half. I got back from seeing Saul a little after 10. He had spent the night prowling around the orbit of our suspects, mostly observing, occasionally asking a question in that low, slow way of his that makes people talk without realizing they're doing it. Saul had not uncovered a smoking gun, but he had found smoke curling out from a few suspicious chimneys. For one, Gerald Eastman had been seen near the Garden Terrace Club late last night, despite claiming to have washed his hands of them. For another, Anna Halvorsen had made a curious stop at a stationery store downtown that specialized in embossed letterhead and personalized paper. Saul's hunch was that she hadn't been buying her mother a gift. I gave Wolfe the rundown while he demolished a stack of griddle cakes. He listened without comment, fork moving steadily, occasionally raising his brows at the butter dish as though it had insulted him. When I finished, he said only, "Pooey. Mr. Eastman is no more capable of removing himself from that circle than a fly is of leaving molasses once embedded. He is not our principal." "Fine," I said, "but then who is?" "Eastman's still sweating enough for 3 men. Anna's sneaking around with envelopes. Harper's crying poor while flashing his tie pins. Lydia's cool as a glass of seltzer, but sharp as broken ice. Take your pick." Wolfe chewed, swallowed, and reached for his beer. "It is not a matter of preference. It is a matter of inevitability. One does not select. One recognizes." That was Wolfe. If he'd been Noah, he wouldn't have had to choose which animals to take aboard. They would have shown up, lined up politely, and explained themselves in Latin. At 11, the brownstone was disturbed again. Fritz came to my office to inform me that a young lady of formidable intention was in the front room. I went to investigate and found Anna Halvorsen herself, wearing a hat that looked like she had stepped out of an afternoon tea in 1932. She gave me a smile that didn't rise above the lips. "I must speak to Mr. Wolfe," she said, crisp as chalk. I let her in. Wolfe did not rise, of course. He greeted her with the level politeness he reserves for women who might prove useful but are not orchids. She got right to it. "I understand you are making inquiries into Miss Vardas's disappearance. I would like to make my position plain. I have no interest in the Garden Terrace Club's theatrics, nor do I owe them anything. My concern is that I am not slandered in some juvenile attempt to dramatize events." "Indeed," Wolfe said, leaning back, fingertips pressing together, "and yet you went to some trouble yesterday to purchase personalized stationery." That shook her just enough to make her blink. "How could you possibly—" She stopped herself, tightened her jaw. "That was for my private use. I should not have to justify my errands to you." "Madam, you are not required to justify anything to me," Wolfe said smoothly. "But facts justify themselves inexorably. Your movements will lead me to conclusions regardless of your candor. Sit down." She sat. She crossed her legs with precision, her hands folded like origami in her lap. I got the impression that if Wolfe asked her to produce a bloody knife, she'd hand it over wrapped in tissue paper and tied with ribbon. "I will ask once," Wolfe said. "Did you send a letter to Miss Vardos on that stationery?" She held his gaze. For a long 10 seconds she didn't answer, and I thought we might be in for a dramatic faint. But finally she said, "Yes, I sent a letter. It was not affectionate, if that's what you want to know. It was cautionary. I wished her to be more prudent." "Prudent about what?" Wolfe asked. "About her appetite for ruining reputations," she snapped. She had made herself quite comfortable threatening people with exposure. If someone was indiscreet in youth, if someone borrowed money imprudently, if someone pursued affections unwisely, Evelyn would hint she knew and would use it to squeeze. I told her it was dangerous. I told her she would invite harm. "And now she has vanished," Wolfe said softly. "Possibly harmed." Anna's face whitened, and for the first time she looked less like a carved cameo and more like a person. "Do you mean to imply—" "I mean nothing. I draw no inference in your presence," Wolfe said. "Archie, see Miss Halvorsen to the door. She has errands to resume." She rose stiffly and departed, without so much as a glance at me. When the front door clicked, Wolfe reached for his beer again. "Archie, summon Mr. Harper for this afternoon. His facade must be breached. Also, ask Saul to return. He may follow Mr. Eastman with a freer hand. It is time to move the pieces." I called Harper, who agreed to come by 4. Saul reported in around noon with a tidbit. Gerald Eastman had spent the late hours not only near the club, but also in quiet conversation with a man known for supplying information discreetly to those who paid. It suggested Gerald might be fishing for a way to defend himself or bury something deeper. At 4 sharp, Clyde Harper was ushered in. He had the nervous glow of a man who had drunk too much coffee and still felt half asleep. He sat, shifting, his hands restless. Wolfe let him stew a full minute before speaking. "Mr. Harper," Wolfe said, "you made much of your financial hardships, yet you support a club of substantial dues and entertainments." "How?" Harper swallowed. "That is, well, one must have appearances. In publishing, one cannot be seen to—" "Foy," Wolfe interrupted. "Appearances do not pay club dues. A man of your income cannot float such an expense without assistance. From whom have you borrowed, and under what pressure does that place you?" Harper wilted. I did borrow. From Gerald Eastman. Just small sums at first, then more. Evelyn knew, of course. She knew everything. She teased me once in front of the others about my patron. I couldn't bear it. If she threatened to expose me, I might lose my job. I begged her to keep it quiet. "And did she?" Wolfe asked. "She said she would if I did her a favor now and then." "Nothing serious. Recommend a play, praise her in reviews, flatter her. I swear I never harmed her." His eyes were damp. Wolfe regarded him. "You were ensnared. A man so trapped can still gnaw through the bars, but he often gnaws his own flesh instead. Archie, that will do for now." When Harper had gone, Wolfe sat still for a long time, his eyes closed. Finally, he said, "We know the crux. Eastman, Harper, Halvorsen, they form a triangle of desperation, and Miss Lydia Vardos presides, untouched, seemingly serene. It is intolerable." "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning," Wolfe said, opening his eyes, "that tomorrow evening we will host them, all of them. Arrange it." I whistled. "A full office gathering? That's early, isn't it? We don't even know if Evelyn's alive or dead." "We know enough," Wolfe said. "The matter must be pressed and the truth compelled. Tomorrow, Archie, make the calls." Archie Goodwin speaking, and if you think it's a picnic keeping track of 4 suspects with their stories crisscrossing like traffic at Times Square, you've clearly never spent a day working under Nero Wolfe. My boss doesn't leave his chair, but he somehow manages to keep the strings tied together while I'm out doing the legwork and occasionally risking my good suit brushing against unsavory types. That morning, I returned from another round of conversations with Miss Carroll, Miss Leach, and the venerable Professor Black. I had notes, stacked, mental and written, but I already knew Wolfe wasn't going to be satisfied with just raw material. He wanted seasoning, structure, and of course, the meat. Wolfe was at his desk, flipping through his orchid journals, while Fritz cleared the remains of breakfast. You'd think a man would show some courtesy for bacon and eggs, but not Wolfe. He'll ignore the best meal of the day if he's chasing a thread of logic. He looked up only when I sat down, ready to unload. "Well?" he demanded, which was his way of saying, "Begin entertaining me." "Carol's story keeps smelling funny," I told him. "She keeps insisting the missing letter was in her handbag right up until the luncheon, but then, suddenly, poof! Either she's lying, or she's blind as a mole." Miss Leach, meanwhile, claims she never touched the bag, but admits she was near it when everyone gathered to toast the hostess. And Professor Black has suddenly remembered he saw Carol leave the room briefly during the same toast. He didn't mention that before. Maybe his memory runs on a delay. Wolfe grunted, which for him was as dramatic as shouting. "And the hostess?" "Miss Fleming says she left the room twice during the event, once to answer a call, another time to fetch additional champagne. Both times she insists Carol's bag was exactly where Carol had left it, by her chair. Except the second time she returned, Carol herself had moved it closer to her side, supposedly to keep an eye on it." "Phew," Wolfe said, leaning back. "The hostesses of this city are worse than politicians. A telephone call during a luncheon. Ridiculous. Fetching champagne herself. Absurd. She employs staff." "Maybe she wanted to stretch her legs," I suggested. "Stretching her legs in the middle of an elaborate luncheon is a distortion of purpose," Wolfe shot back. She wished to leave the room and therefore invented excuses. The why is the crux. I shrugged. Your crux is my headache. Meanwhile, Saul called in. He trailed Professor Black last night. The old goat paid a visit to a lawyer's office on Madison. Not his lawyer, a firm specializing in copyright and estate disputes. He stayed there nearly an hour. When Saul tried to nose around, they clammed up tighter than a banker on tax day. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. He didn't often look sharp at anything outside a plate of trout or a blooming orchid. A lawyer in copyright. Yes, a paper, a document, perhaps literary. This aligns with a suspicion I had from the beginning. I leaned forward. You had a suspicion from the beginning. Archie. Wolfe pressed his fingertips together like they were about to hatch a plan. When a woman says, as Miss Fleming did, that she knows the ending, she's not merely speaking socially. She spoke literally, or near enough. She possesses a piece of writing, a draft, an idea someone values. Something unfinished, vulnerable to theft. I whistled. Low, so the missing letter wasn't just a scrap of gossip. We're talking intellectual property, somebody's novel maybe, or a confession disguised as one. And Carol was carrying it in her bag like a grocery list. Yes, Wolfe said, and now it has vanished. Do you see, Archie, the delightful symmetry? A gathering of literary individuals, an unfinished work whose ending is coveted, and a theft executed under the nose of them all. The irony would appeal to Cicero. I said I wasn't sure Cicero ever attended luncheons at the Gramercy Club. But Wolfe ignored me. He reached for the beer Fritz had set at his elbow. The next step is to apply pressure. One does not squeeze all at once. One applies, releases, applies again, until the object cracks. That's your department, I said. Mine's keeping them from slamming the door in my face. Do you want me to push Carol again? Not yet. Miss Leach. She is the key. She hovers. She observes. She takes nothing directly. Yet she knows. Press her, Archie. Softly for now. She will not withstand repeated inquiry. Do it today. And summon Saul here at 7. He will sit in. When Wolfe starts issuing schedules like that, it means we're rolling toward the heart of the thing. He had no intention of letting the matter drift until someone confessed. No, he'd orchestrate it like a chess endgame, moving the pawns until one of them toppled over in guilt. So I went to pay Miss Leach another visit. She lived on West 74th, in a narrow apartment building that smelled of books, dust, and too much ambition in too small a space. She opened the door herself, wearing spectacles and a cardigan that looked borrowed from an older, richer aunt. Her smile was thin, defensive. You again, she said. That's me, I agreed. Persistent as a bill collector? May I come in? She hesitated but stepped aside. Her place was a nest of manuscripts, clipped articles, and teacups balancing on precarious stacks. I chose a chair that looked like it wouldn't collapse under me and gave her the grin I reserve for nervous witnesses. You told me you never touched Carol's handbag. That's still true? She fidgeted. Yes. Why are you asking again? Haven't you bothered us enough? Because Carol insists you hovered, and Professor Black suddenly remembers Carol left the room. Funny how memories bloom late. Do you remember that? Miss Leach wrung her hands. She may have left. I didn't notice. Everyone was talking. The hostess kept drawing attention to herself. That's her job, isn't it? I said. Still, someone took that letter, unless you think it walked out on its own. Her lips tightened. Maybe it should have. The letter shouldn't exist at all. That was a new tune. Why not? She looked trapped, like a rabbit watching the fox creep closer. Because it wasn't hers to show. Miss Carol should never have carried it. It belonged to... She stopped, bit her lip, and shook her head. Number I can't. I didn't push harder just then, because Wolfe had told me to apply pressure in stages, and I've learned not to improvise past his tempo. Instead, I told her we'd talk again and left her sweating. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was expecting my report. He listened without interruption, then gave a slow nod. Good. She betrayed herself. The letter should not exist, she says. Excellent. You call that excellent? She's stonewalling. Not for long, Wolfe said. She admitted the letter's ownership is disputed. That is more than enough. The others will confirm it one way or another. Tomorrow, Archie, we shall invite them all here. The circle must close, and in my office it shall. It was the signal. The gathering was coming, the one Wolfe lived for and the suspects dreaded. He would seat them in our chairs, let them squirm, and then start peeling their stories apart like layers of an onion. And when the last layer came off, someone was going to stink of guilt. I don't pretend I knew which one yet. But Wolfe's tone, smug and final, made it clear he did. He always did, long before I caught up. I'm just the guy who writes it down, but even I could feel the tension building toward the final showdown in that old office. When Wolfe announced that the company was to reconvene at his office the following evening, I didn't expect roses and sunshine. What I did expect was a collection of sulky suspects who had by now realized they were being maneuvered towards something inevitable. The funny thing about inevitability, though, is that people fight it hardest when they've already lost. So I took the calls, made the rounds, and delivered the invitations as if I were sending out cards for a christening instead of a summons for what was essentially Wolfe's theater of war. Most of them accepted with a type of short politeness that meant they wouldn't sleep that night, which suited Wolfe fine. A tired suspect is a pliable suspect. Cynthia Darnell answered the phone herself. Her tone suggested that she wasn't sure if attending meant clearing her name or tying a noose, but she agreed promptly. Edmund Baird, the playwright, tried to talk around it, claiming deadlines, rehearsal troubles, and the general fragility of his artistic soul. I leaned on him just enough, and when I mentioned Wolfe's name, he came down from Olympus and said he would be present. Annabel Cho was brisk, efficient, and not at all rattled. Too efficient, if you ask me. She treated it like a calendar entry. 7 sharp, West 35th. Understood. Leonard Phelps, the host who had started the ball rolling by hiring Wolfe in the first place, sounded like he had a fever when I called. He stammered that of course he would attend, though I had the feeling he'd sooner crawl across broken glass. And the last was Natalie's assistant, Oliver Trent, whose acceptance was curt and resentful, like a man who wanted to tell me where I could shove the invitation but didn't quite dare. All in all, it was shaping up to be an audience Wolfe could savor. The following evening, with the orchids fed, beer set within arm's reach, and chairs arranged with the precision of a chessboard, Wolfe settled into position. He hadn't moved much for days, physically, but you could see the wheels spinning behind his heavy-lidded eyes. He was a battleship at anchor, conserving power for the broadside. I, on the other hand, had the task of running the show, opening doors, seating suspects, making sure no one bolted. Not that anyone ever does. There's something about the atmosphere in that office when Wolfe has declared an assembly. It's as binding as steel. They arrived one by one, some early, some late, each carrying the scent of nerves like a cheap cologne. Cynthia came first, looking pale but determined, with the kind of polished outfit that said she was trying to armor herself. Edmund Baird slouched in next, scarf tossed around his neck like a flag of defiance, eyes darting as though lines of dialogue might rescue him. Annabel Cho was cool as a glacier, handing me her coat as if I were the bellhop of destiny. Leonard Phelps looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 days, sagging under some invisible weight, and Oliver Trent rounded out the collection with a tight jaw and darting eyes, obviously rehearsing a performance of indignation. Once they were settled in the red chairs, Wolfe opened his eyes fully and addressed them with the courtesy of a judge beginning session. "You all know why you are here," he said, and that deep voice of his filled the room like a gavel strike. "A crime has been committed. Not of blood, but of trust and subterfuge. You are here because you intersected with Miss Natalie Voss, and with each other, and because among you resides the author of her undoing." The silence that followed could have been cut with a bread knife. I stayed leaned against my desk, pen poised over my notebook, though I wasn't writing much. The important stuff you don't forget. Wolfe let the silence breathe until Edmund Baird squirmed and tried to break it. Are we expected to, what, confess? This is ridiculous. Natalie's troubles were her own making. She always had too many secrets. "Precisely," Wolfe replied, lifting a finger. "But not all secrets are self-forged. Some are planted, tended, and then exposed for profit or revenge. Miss Voss knew something. The final words she delivered at that party, before she disappeared from your circle, were neither spontaneous nor trivial. She knew the ending, as she put it. The ending of what, gentleman and lady, is the heart of the matter." That started the parade. Each of them, in turn, had to account for themselves. Cynthia claimed ignorance, but betrayed irritation when Wolfe mentioned her dependence on Voss for introductions to financiers. Edmund blustered about creative property, insisting that Natalie had never influenced his work beyond a casual suggestion or two. Annabel maintained that her job was to manage, not to meddle, and accused Wolfe of wasting everyone's time. Leonard kept wringing his hands, muttering about misunderstandings, and Oliver Trent snapped that he was tired of being treated as the errand boy in a melodrama. Wolfe didn't hurry. He coaxed them along with the patience of a man feeding pigeons, letting them flutter and squawk until the grain of truth peeked through. He directed a particular line of questioning at Annabel Cho about her role as Voss's public relations handler, pressing gently but steadily on what exactly Natalie had been planning to reveal. Annabel parried, but her control wasn't as airtight as she thought. I caught her eyes flickering toward Leonard once or twice, which Wolfe didn't miss either. When the air in the room had grown thick enough, Wolfe shifted the pressure. "We come to the tampering," he said, low and deliberate. A file removed from Miss Voss's papers, an alteration to a list, the scent of intrusion. Mr. Goodwin observed the remnants, and Saul Panzer traced the sequence. That detail alone tells us much about who feared exposure. The suspects reacted like puppets with tugged strings. Cynthia gasped faintly. Edmund sat forward, indignant. Annabel's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. Leonard looked close to fainting. Oliver muttered something about invasions of privacy. It was Wolfe's orchestra, and every instrument played on cue. But Wolfe didn't spring the trap just yet. He allowed them to stew, turning the matter over, watching the sweat bead. He shifted the talk to motives. Money owed, reputations threatened, alliances betrayed. The words hung heavy, and one by one they realized that he had assembled not just a case, but a cage. Every avenue they might take for escape was blocked by his quiet insistence. I've seen it before, dozens of times, but it never loses its charge. Wolfe, immovable in his chair, guiding the room like a conductor, his words slashing sharper than any blade. They could squirm, deny, argue, but in the end, they had no defense against logic drawn tight as piano wire. At a certain point, I knew he had them where he wanted them, though he hadn't yet named the culprit. He leaned back, folded his hands over his middle, and let out a small sigh, the kind that means the heavy lifting is done. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall speak plainly. Tonight has been for orientation, for you and for me. You will return, and the conclusion will be provided." Protests erupted. Edmund demanded clarity. Cynthia looked ready to cry. Leonard whispered, "Please," as though Wolfe were some merciless oracle. Annabel said coolly that she had a schedule and didn't appreciate the suspense. Oliver swore under his breath, but Wolfe, of course, was unmoved. He rang for Fritz, who entered with wine and canapes, and announced that the evening was over. One by one, they filed out, each looking as if they were leaving the gallows but expecting to be summoned back at dawn. When the door shut at last, Wolfe grunted, closed his eyes, and murmured, "Pfui," which was his way of saying that all the grandstanding, lying, and maneuvering had been just as predictable as breathing. He had seen what he needed. I asked him if he intended to actually sleep before lowering the boom. He cracked one eye and gave me the look he saves for rhetorical questions. Then he said, "Archie, tomorrow we shall have the ending that Miss Voss foresaw. Fetch Saul in the morning. We'll need the final stitch before I tear the seam wide open." Which, translated into plain English, meant that the following evening's gathering would not be a rehearsal. It would be the last act, and I had a feeling none of our suspects would like their roles in it. I won't lie and say I hadn't been in tighter spots, but I'll admit that by the time Wolfe had Saul on retainer, Lon Cohen primed with his typewriter, and Fritz in a state of culinary distress because of the interruptions, I knew we were close to something big. Wolfe had been working with a silence that wasn't silence at all. It was like a mill grinding slowly but constantly behind his forehead. He would close his eyes, tilt back in the chair, and I could practically see the cogs turning. Trouble was, the longer he sat, the more time I had to run interference with the suspects, and believe me, they weren't making it easy. By now, I had faced down Mrs. Ellery twice, managed to dodge more attempts at charm from Miss Cardew than I cared to count, and had found myself fending off subtle little probes from Kramer. He wanted to know what Wolfe was up to, and since Wolfe hadn't seen fit to tell me yet, I was running on fumes. But I had learned long ago that when Wolfe was this quiet, you didn't poke him with a stick unless you wanted to end up in the Hudson with cement shoes. The day kicked off with a development so small you might have overlooked it. I came down to the office to find Wolfe staring at a sheet of paper, not reading, not writing, just staring. The page was blank, except for a name written neatly in the top left corner, Joanna Martell. When I asked, he gave me one of his patented glares and told me to go bother someone else. That's Wolfe speak for, "I'm thinking harder than you can keep up with." Joanna Martell. She had been at the dinner too, quiet, well-dressed, with the sort of face that might pass you on the street without leaving a dent in your memory. But apparently, she had left one in Wolfe's because when he stares at a name long enough to ignore a request for beer, I know better than to assume it's trivial. That afternoon I had an assignment. Wolfe wanted me to revisit Miss Cardew. He said it like a doctor telling you you'll need another surgery, and I didn't blame him. Every time I stepped into her parlor, I felt like I was walking into a well-scented trap. She smiled when I showed up, fluttered like a butterfly about to land, and gave me the look women give when they think you're both an audience and an accomplice. I asked questions, again about her late-night phone calls, her connection to Mrs. Ellery, and whether she had any reason to dislike the hostess. She wrung her hands, shed a few drops of liquid sincerity, and swore she loved the hostess like a sister. My notes were full of contradictions, but nothing I could pin down. Meanwhile, Saul was tailing Joanna Martell. He came back with a report that evening. She had been seen speaking to Mrs. Ellery outside a florist's shop the night before the dinner. That wouldn't normally earn more than a shrug, but Wolfe's eyebrows twitched upward when Saul mentioned it, which in Wolfe language is the equivalent of fireworks. The big moment came 2 days later, when Wolfe gave the order I'd been waiting for. "Archie," he said, putting down a glass of beer with surgical precision, "invite them, all of them, tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. If you've never seen Nero Wolfe gather suspects in his office, then you don't know what theater looks like without footlights. He sits in that oversized chair of his, steeples his fingers, and lets everyone else shuffle in like school children dragged before the principal. The room tightens, the air gets thick, and he doesn't have to move an inch to be the center of the stage. The next day I played usher. Mrs. Ellery arrived in a fur that looked like it had eaten better meals than some families I know. Miss Cardew came in lavender silk and a smile sharp enough to cut string. Joanna Martell looked plain, almost apologetic, but her eyes darted the way a rabbit's do when it's cornered. Charles Deering wore a suit that said, "I'm respectable," but the tension in his jaw told another story. I lined them up in Wolfe's office like ornaments on a mantle. Wolfe barely acknowledged them. He took his time, adjusting his cuffs, sipping his beer, then began in that smooth, heavy voice of his. "We are here," he said, "because of a manuscript. A manuscript that ended the life of its author before it was ever published. And we are here because one of you believed the contents of that manuscript would destroy you." You could have heard Fritz's souffle fall in the kitchen. Mrs. Ellery stiffened. Miss Cardew's smile dimmed by 2 watts. Deering scowled. Joanna Martell clasped her hands so tight her knuckles went white. Wolfe went on, ignoring them as if they were no more than decorative furniture. He spoke of motives, financial ruin, reputational collapse, marital betrayal. The manuscript had contained something, a secret about one of them. He didn't say which one, not yet. Then came the subtle trespass, the part Wolfe loved to dangle. "One of you," he said, "came into this house. You touched what was not yours." A note was moved, a folder disturbed. "I permit no such liberties here." It was foolish as well as criminal. His eyes opened then, and he turned them on Mrs. Ellery. "You, madam, believed you had removed the threat. You were mistaken." She blustered, protested, called it outrageous. Wolfe silenced her with a flick of his hand. "Do not attempt to bluff me. You tampered with a draft, but it was not the draft you feared most. That remains, and I've read it." That last part was a lie, of course. Wolfe hadn't read anything. He didn't have to. He had pieced together enough from Saul, me, and his own infernal machinery of logic to make it sound as if he had the whole thing. Mrs. Ellery caved like wet plaster. She broke down in a fit of denial that sounded too much like a confession, trying to redirect suspicion toward Deering. That was Wolfe's cue. He turned the barrel elsewhere. "No, Mrs. Ellery, your guilt lies in theft, but the true instigator, the one who sought to ruin our hostess, is another." His gaze shifted, slow and merciless, to Joanna Martell. Her composure cracked. Tears spilled. She confessed in a rush that the hostess had written something about her, something that would expose a scandal in her family. She had begged, pleaded, even threatened to keep it out of circulation. When persuasion failed, she had resorted to Mrs. Ellery, who had her own reasons for silencing the book. Together, they had tried to suppress it. Wolfe sat back, as if the weight of the world had slid off his chest. "There," he said softly. "The end was written before it began. Miss Martell, you lacked the courage to endure truth. Mrs. Ellery, you lacked the restraint to leave well enough alone. And between you, you corrupted a work that should have spoken for itself." Kramer, who had been lurking in the background with his usual bulldog scowl, stepped forward to take over. He had the confessions he needed, and Wolfe had the satisfaction of closing his circle. When the suspects had filed out, some in cuffs, some in tears, some muttering threats, silence settled over the brownstone again. Fritz brought dinner. Wolfe ate with relish, as if the whole affair had been no more disruptive than a rainstorm on orchids. "You'll notice, Archie," he said between bites, "that those who most fear revelation are the quickest to destroy. Truth is seldom fatal, but the fear of it is." I gave him a grin and said, "Fine philosophy, boss. But next time, can we try a case that doesn't involve women who think I'm theirs for the taking?" He sniffed, reached for the salt, and muttered, "Pfui." That was Wolfe's way of saying the curtain had fallen. The play was over, and the brownstone was sacred again. The brownstone was filled with the particular silence that only comes after a storm, the kind that doesn't sweep the furniture across the room but rearranges it in your head. The suspects had left in tight little knots of disbelief, irritation, and wounded pride, and Wolfe had remained in his chair, his eyelids drifting shut as if he had just finished a complicated but ultimately predictable chess game. I sat at my desk, flipping my notebook shut with more flair than was necessary, mostly because I needed something physical to remind me I wasn't just a spectator in his theater. "Archie," Wolfe murmured without opening his eyes. "The matter is concluded. Mr. Parker will be advised to present himself at the district attorney's office in the morning. I trust you will ensure the machinery of law does not grind sluggishly." I leaned back, lacing my fingers behind my head. "You mean you want me to make sure he doesn't try to hop a train out of Penn Station or take an unscheduled swim in the East River?" "I can manage. But I have to admit, Wolfe, it still twists my brain that this whole circus hinged on a piece of paper hardly larger than a grocery list." He opened one eye, enough to give me the benefit of his disdain. "You oversimplify. The note was not merely a document. It was an assertion of control, a fulcrum of leverage. Miss Easton's hold over her guests rested on her perception of knowledge withheld and knowledge dispensed. Mr. Parker, lacking wit and stability, mistook her little drama for a threat and lashed out with pitiful cunning." "Cunning, sure," I said. "Though, if you ask me, putting poison in a bottle of wine is about as subtle as painting 'I did it' across the nearest wall. He couldn't have pulled it off if she hadn't staged her gathering the way she did. You'd think someone like Lila Easton, sharp as a tack and twice as polished, would have seen him coming." "She did," Wolfe said quietly, closing his eye again. But her intelligence was alloyed with arrogance. She assumed her performance was too elaborate to be misinterpreted. She underestimated Parker's panic. That gave me a chill, though I didn't show it. The thought that Lila Easton, who had staged her soiree like a general planning a campaign, had still lost to one man's fear made the air in the office feel tighter. I got up and crossed to the drinks cabinet. A little rye never hurt the digestion after a dose of Wolfe's truth serum. "You know," I said, pouring, "you could have let me in on the grand scheme earlier. I wouldn't have minded a heads up that Parker had more than a temper problem. Instead, you let me trot around town, charming the socks off suspects, while he sat there stewing in his own venom." Wolfe let out something halfway between a sigh and a growl. "If I had told you what I suspected without sufficient foundation, you would have acted precipitously. Your charm is both an asset and a liability. I'll take that as a compliment." I sipped the rye and let it burn a clean trail. "Still, it makes me wonder. You said Easton's note was the fulcrum. But Parker, he was always going to break, wasn't he? Whether she had written anything or not, he was primed like a cheap firecracker." "That," Wolfe admitted, "is likely. But the note provided the ignition. Human vanity often does. A man of Parker's fragility could not abide uncertainty, nor the suspicion that others held knowledge of his weaknesses. The performance Miss Easton staged gave him too much mirror to look into." I walked back toward my desk and stopped at the edge of the rug, looking at him sprawled there like a Roman emperor who had just sentenced an unfortunate gladiator to the lions. The orchids upstairs, no doubt, were sighing in their humid paradise, untouched by poison or panic or Parker. "You're saying she wrote her own ending the moment she summoned that crowd?" "I do not traffic in melodrama, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice edged with the irritation of having his precision dulled. "But yes, her miscalculation was fatal to her own peace of mind, if not her body. She presumed omniscience. It is always the downfall of a hostess who imagines herself playwright." The rye settled in, warm and heavy. I thought of Lila Easton's living room, with its half-drained glasses and the nervous energy that had clung to her guests like perfume. A woman who liked to choreograph, to orchestrate, who wanted her world to end with a curtain line she herself had chosen. Instead, Wolfe had written it for her, cool and unblinking, exposing the weak link in her cast. There was a long pause, during which the city outside hummed its late evening tune, and Wolfe breathed with the steady assurance of a man whose dinner reservation with himself would not be interrupted again. I broke it with the obvious. "So Parker goes to the DA. Easton, what happens to her?" "She survives," Wolfe said simply. "She will withdraw into her circle, diminished, chastened. Perhaps she will learn restraint. Perhaps not. I'm not her tutor, nor her confessor." "You almost sound sorry for her." His lips curled, but it wasn't a smile. "Pity is inefficient. But it is an instinct. Miss Easton's talent was real. Her folly was greater. She wished to be omnipotent in her drawing room. She discovered that omnipotence is a fiction, even within four walls. That was Wolfe for you. A philosopher disguised as a sedentary gourmand. He wouldn't admit to pity, but the flavor of it was in the room anyway, mixed with the tang of rye and the faint smell of beer he hadn't drunk yet. The phone rang then, jolting the stillness. I grabbed it, half expecting Inspector Kramer to bark down the line. Instead, it was Saul Panza, efficient as always, confirming that Parker had been picked up quietly, without fuss. I relayed the news. Wolfe's head tilted just enough to acknowledge that his machine of deduction had completed its cycle. "Very well," he said. "Then dinner." Fritz must have been waiting for the signal, because within minutes the aroma of veal and truffles was sneaking into the office. Wolfe rose, his bulk moving with surprising smoothness for a man who otherwise lived like a monument. As he headed toward the dining room, I fell into step beside him. "You know," I said, "there's one thing I still don't get. If Easton wanted to play mastermind, why choose that night, that group? Why not keep Parker out of the equation entirely? She must have known he was unstable." "She invited him precisely because he was unstable," Wolfe said, not slowing. "She thought to showcase her dominance by keeping him under her control. It is a common flaw among manipulators. They crave not merely obedience, but the spectacle of obedience. They mistake volatility for spice. And ended up with poison instead," I muttered. At the dining table, Wolfe lowered himself into his chair with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. Fritz unveiled the plates, and Wolfe inhaled with satisfaction that almost erased the poison from the evening. Almost. He picked up his fork, glanced at me, and delivered the kind of closing line that didn't need embroidery. "There is no greater vanity, Archie, than to presume one may dictate the final line of one's own story. Life, indifferent and unamused, reserves the right to improvise." I let that hang in the air, polished and final as a judge's gavel. Then I raised my glass to him, because sometimes you have to toast the man who could sit in a chair all day and still outmaneuver everyone in the room. "Here's to you, Wolfe," I said, "and to endings no one sees coming." He inclined his head, then devoted his full attention to dinner, which, as far as Nero Wolfe was concerned, was the only ending worth knowing.